You've probably seen Dr. Craig Evans on one of scores of different television programs that he has been interviewed on that have gone all over the world. Dr. Craig Evans is the foremost scholar on Jesus Christ, I think there is, in the evangelical world, and many would back that statement of mine. The John Bisagno Distinguished Professor of Christian Origins at Houston Baptist University, Dr. Evans is an expert on the historical grounds of New Testament writings. He's published more than 600 scholarly studies, including more than 70 books. His book, Fabricating Jesus, How Modern Scholars Distort the Gospels, has become an international bestseller. Dr. Evans, thank you for being here today.
You're very welcome.
You've got such a unique career. I want you to take us back. I mean, how do you become Craig Evans? I mean, give us the footprint.
Well, a lot of it is I was just a person of curiosity. I wanted to know why things were so, where things came from, the history of things. I had a mind that had curiosity behind it. And I enjoyed reading throughout junior high, high school. I was interested in history all along. I used to tell my parents, I want to be a historian when I grow up, that kind of thing. And my father wanted me to be an attorney, which I seriously considered all through university. So education, obviously, is a real important thing. And so I majored in history at an excellent undergraduate university in Southern California. Oh man, did they teach me how to write papers. I'd turn in a paper, and if there were things wrong with it, I heard all about it and had to revise, correct, redo it. So by the time I went to seminary instead of law school, having decided that I really wanted to know more about God, and I wanted to know more about the ultimate questions than, say, law, the practice of law, I was well prepared going into seminary, and so I was ready for what seminary had to offer. The study of Scripture, the study of the biblical languages. I wasn't afraid of that. I enjoyed my Greek and Hebrew courses. I wanted more of it. And so when I finished my Master of Divinity degree, I decided to return to Southern California to the Claremont Graduate University, which had at that time an excellent program in New Testament and related studies. And so I got into that program, and I did everything. I wanted to learn about Gnosticism. I studied Coptic. I wanted to learn about the Dead Sea Scrolls. I had the chance to study with William Brownlee, who, along with John Trevor, also at Claremont, were the first scholars from North America to see the scrolls when they were found in 1947 in Israel, where they were. That was a great year, 47, 48. And so there I was learning at their feet from people who were the first to see the scrolls, talk about them, and recognize their significance. I learned about ancient Greek magic texts. I learned a lot about the book culture in antiquity. There was a rabbi at Claremont. There was James Sanders at Claremont, famous for his work on the scrolls, Jewish literature, Targums. So I didn't know it at the time, but I was getting baptized into the world of Jesus and the literature of that time, even the archaeology. I had no idea at the time how that would really pay off later. I just sensed at the time this is the right thing to do. So I wrote a dissertation where I was able to make use of this learning. And so my dissertation drove me into all these different texts and different languages. And so by the time the dissertation was finished and then edited, updated, and published, I really knew something about everything that related to the world of Jesus, even though I didn't think of myself as a Jesus scholar yet. But as you might know, in the 1980s, there was the third quest, as everybody called it. People like Marcus Borg, John Dominic Crossan, Tom Wright. People were weighing in the 1980s, and I realized, whoa, we're now talking in a way I better understand. It sounds a lot more historical than the new quest back in the 50s and 60s. And I had studied under a new quest of Jesus Professor James Robinson, and I could never understand what the whole point of that was. It struck me as subjective, highly driven by dubious theological interests. It wasn't very historical. So I wasn't too sure if that would be for me, but in the 1980s it had changed. And people were talking about archaeology, people were talking about the culture of the time, what the Jewish people were like, how Jesus fit into that, what was different about Jesus, what was also similar, how people would respond to him, and the Dead Sea Scrolls suddenly became relevant. They exploded on the scene in the late 80s, early 90s, and there I was positioned to deal with it. Some of the crazy ideas relating to Gnosticism, I was in a position to critique that because I understood Gnosticism. I'd studied it. I'd studied Coptic. People talking about the Gospel of Thomas. Oh, this was going to break open everything and explain all sorts of stuff. I knew it wouldn't. I was able to read the text in its original language. I had studied with some of the top Coptic Gnostic scholars when I was at Claremont. So then I realized I found my calling. It was the late 1980s, and I waded into the historical Jesus discussion, began publishing articles in the 90s, books, talking about the kind of stuff you needed to do if you were going to get to the truth, if you were going to come up with answers that made sense. You needed to know the scrolls, the pseudepigrapha, the apocrypha. You needed to know the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic, the Latin, and so forth. You couldn't be an armchair scholar up in the ivory tower somewhere. You had to go to Israel. You had to get in the dirt. You had to visit the digs. You had to know the archaeologists. Then you knew what was going on. And so that's what took me to where I am now. It was more than 25 years ago. I was right there in the trenches and meeting with the archaeologists, and I'll tell you, it just took off. Pretty soon there was media. That was something I never thought would happen. Mm-hmm. What's this? Archaeologists and biblical scholars are now TV personalities showing up on documentaries.
Give us an example of all the media you've done.
Well, I finally began keeping careful records, but I've been in more than 100 documentaries and news programs. The one that I still think about as just an incredible experience, it was Stone Phillips, who hosted Dateline NBC for a number of years.
Yep.
Stone was such an interesting fellow. He was a seeker. Privately, we would have conversations. We'd be in the green room chewing away on Danish or something, getting ready for the next shoot, and he'd ask me questions personally. Professor Evans, do you believe in the resurrection? Mm-hmm. I said, well, I do. And he said, well, how did it happen? How is such a thing possible? I really appreciated this vulnerability on his part, this openness. And I'd say, well, Stone, let me tell you. And we'd have these great conversations. Well, we did this documentary, and there were other scholars involved. Some of them, I've mentioned their names already. And so Stone was telling me he was trying to convince the NBC people, this is a good topic. And they very grudgingly said, well, okay, pursue it. Then he told them, man, after I interviewed these people, it should be a 2-hour special, not just a 1 hour. Well, try telling somebody at NBC, CBS, you name it, primetime television, 2 hours.
Yep. They
said, okay, we'll do it. So they aired it that week. It was in late February 2004, and there were 25 million viewers.
Unbelievable.
It was, and I joke about this, it was eclipsed by only one program that week, and that was American Idol, the finale. Well, it was just huge, and so they re-aired it in early April that same year, and over 20 million watched it again. So it was estimated that about a quarter of all the adults in North America saw all or some of it. I mean, it's just staggering when you add it up. And it was in Canada, it was shown in the UK and around the world, the English-speaking world. That was just this one documentary. After that, it just went nuts. Mm-hmm. And it's a rare month that goes by. I'm not on the phone with somebody saying, we're thinking of doing a documentary. Are you interested in being involved? It'll be on Jesus and archaeology or something like that. And so it just goes on and on and on. So yeah, at least 100 documentaries and news programs. I was part of the Gospel of Judas thing. That was a sensation a decade ago.
And we might just make sure everyone understands that National Geographic came out with a front cover on apocryphal Gospel of Judas, acted like it was brand new news. And the whole panel was basically people that, were not our orientation of evangelical Orthodox. But the one single scholar they picked that they brought to New York and trained for media, because that was an explosion when that hit, was Dr. Craig Evans.
I was, as you just said, I was the only evangelical. There were a couple of atheists, a couple of people who would tilt very far to the left. There was also Father Donald Sr., a Roman Catholic, but I was the evangelical, I guess the token. And at the press release, which was in the spring of 2006, the theater, and this is at the National Geographic headquarters in Washington, D.C., the room, a theater that they used for the press release, was just lined, the walls, shoulder to shoulder, lined with media. Over 130 media were there, much of it television. The cameras, the lights were in our eyes. I could hardly see. And we made our presentation. We were then carried around in limos throughout Washington, D.C., to the BBC, the CBC, I mean, you name it, NBC, CBS, everybody wanted to interview us on radio and television, and it was just nuts for 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
Well, National Geographic keeps careful records, and they would email us and let us know about how it's going. And I got an email, and there were over 1,000 newspapers around the world that carried it on the front page.
Wow.
It was just staggering. The Tokyo Times, 1,000+ newspapers, front page. They even kept the records of how many of those front pages the story was above the fold or below the fold.
Sure.
It was amazing. Of course, the phone just rang off the hook. The secretary at Katy University, where I was at that time, she was about to go crazy because the phone just did not stop ringing. What I have learned from all this, working with museums, when we do archaeology displays, something about the scrolls or whatever, or if it's television, it never fails. The producers always underestimate the interest.
Right.
It is always greater than, sometimes several times greater.
Sure.
The museum will say, well, we'll put it in this exhibit. And the line then goes around the building. Well, we'll put you in this theater to speak to the crowd. And the people are lined up all over the place. And then, you have to do an encore performance because we had to shoo away so many people. It's always that way. And my sense, and I've been very active in media for more than 20 years now, my sense is there is this great hunger throughout the world. Doesn't matter if it's English speaking or what it is, throughout the world there's a great hunger. You start talking about Jesus and his world. You start talking about the Gospels that tell the story of Jesus. You start talking about the archaeology that relates to his time or literature that relates to his time, and you get huge crowds. There is enormous interest in this subject. And I'm glad to be right in the middle of it, where I can counter some of the crazy ideas that come from popular circles or extreme ideas from scholars, and be right in the middle of it and help people understand what's going on and what Jesus really taught, what he really did, and why he is so significant.
We're talking to Dr. Craig Evans, who is the John Bisagno Distinguished Professor of Christian Origins at Houston Baptist University. Also, you were the lightning rod that started the Houston Theological Seminary of Houston Baptist University in cooperation with Second Baptist Church. That has been an enormous, tremendous step. I mean, you have not only have the students, but you have surveyors. And I want to talk about that in a few moments. But I want to segue. I remember when we met you. My son came to see you at a Dead Sea Scrolls exhibit at a museum. And he was just taken with you. And one night he said to me at dinner, he said, "Dad, if I could only study under Craig Evans." And I'll never forget it. I said, "Well, why don't you get him on the phone right now?" And he said, "Well, how do we do that?" And I said, "I don't know. Find out where he lives." And so he did whatever he did. And we actually called you that night from a restaurant and asked if we could fly to Nova Scotia and sit down with you. And we did a few months later. And I remember Jenny, your wife, making chocolate chip cookies that I shouldn't have eaten, as many as I did. And there was Jeremiah and you in that room. And in the providence of God, you really were a great academic mentor to him. And he did his PhD, and an academic mentor to both Christy and myself. And we studied under you and did our D-Min degrees at Acadia University, flying 15 times to Halifax because we were so interested in studying under you. And it was one of the greatest periods of our life. But God began to move you into even greater areas. I mean, Mark Burnett, this television innovator who created Shark Tank and Survivor and all the shows, he was controlling, I think, 6 of 7 nights in prime time at one time, decided to do a series on the Bible with the History Channel. And who did he pick as the New Testament script advisor? Dr. Craig Evans. What kind of experience was it working with Burnett? That later, I think, hit 100 million people.
Yeah, you're right. 100 million people watched all or at least parts of the Bible miniseries that aired in March of 2013. It was a couple of years before that Lightworkers Media telephoned me in my office and wanted to know if I'd be interested in working with Mark Burnett and Roma Downey.
And Roma Downey of Touched by an Angel for many seasons.
And of course my family...
And they're married, although it's different last names, they are married.
Yeah, that's right. In the 1990s, she had that hit television program, Touched by an Angel, and it was a favorite with our family. And our daughters were younger then, of course, and they enjoyed the show. It was a very, very, I thought, edifying and fun and entertaining program. We were blessed by it. We enjoyed it. So this gentleman from the UK, he was calling from London. He called me up and wanted to know if I'd be interested in helping them assess their type scripts, their scripts for the television series. And would I read, especially 6 or 7 of them, very carefully and give them critiques, make corrections, and answer questions when they're actually filming in North Africa. That was interesting. So I said, sure, I'm happy to do that. And then I said to him, I said, well, you know, tell Roma for me, if you don't mind, that my wife and I and our family really enjoyed her in Touched by an Angel. He said, oh, I will. Well, my wife hears that. She rolls her eyes. Oh, Craig, why did you say that? Minutes later, the phone rang. Jenny answered it. Her eyes about popped out. She held it and looked at me and said, Roma Downey is on the phone. And she talked 15, 20 minutes. And what impressed me then, and this is the whole point of what I'm saying, she was really into it. I realized there's a commitment here to being accurate, to understanding what the Bible actually says, to understand its culture, its history, its time, and they wanted to get it right. And when I met them in person at one of the press releases in New York, it was in late November 2012, there she was, Mark Burnett, Roma Downey. Jenny and I walked in and sat down. There was going to be this reception and the show previews and so on, and a lot of media were there. Mark Burnett just looked right at me, and we'd never met each other. We had emailed each other. We talked on the phone a couple times. I thought, well, how does he know? And he just looked right at me and walked right up to me and shook my hand and said, I just wanted to thank you. I want you to know every single email you sent where you talked about the script, when you made suggestions about how it might be more accurate, where you answered our questions. I read every email. Thank you so much for that. And then Roma came over and gave me a big hug.
Yeah.
So I can say now I've been hugged by an angel. But I was really impressed. They had a commitment to getting it right. So this was not some Hollywood, let's just sensationalize things. It was a really good job, and then I was really glad I was part of it.
Well, I remember when we were in Washington, D.C. at the presidential prayer breakfast at the Sheraton there, and Mark and Roma, we were on the concierge level talking about, it was just getting ready to launch. And they told me just what an impact you had made. And just a few weeks ago, I was in their home in Malibu, and, you know, who would have ever thought that a guy who produces Shark Tank and The Voice would have this global reach, and 1 million units of that DVD have gone all over the world. Your ministry truly has been global. You decided to go to Budapest and to complete a second degree. Can you just capsule that for us?
Well, yes. As everybody knows, the Iron Curtain collapsed more than 25 years ago. And what this meant was that people interested in theology, Bible, academic studies, seminary, ministry had a chance now to travel, study, and get their academic credentials upgraded. The trouble was they didn't have what's called a habilitation. Now that doesn't mean anything to North Americans, but it means a lot to continental Europeans. You can't have just one PhD. You have to have a second doctorate. It's called a habilitation, and that habilitates you. It enables you, qualifies you to be a professor. And so they had this backlog of all these students, thanks to all those decades of communism where this was impossible. Now they had these students getting PhDs, but there was a backlog of habilitation. So I habilitated so I could help these students pass their exams, get their degrees, and get their qualifications. So here I was in my 50s, and I thought, okay, it's time to go back to school. And so as you just said, I habilitated at the Reformed University in Budapest several years ago. That was an experience, and gave a lecture in German, a lecture in English, defended my lectures, talked about my dissertation, and I'm happy to say I passed.
I want you, just before we close, and just remember, you have an opportunity to study with one of the greatest theologians alive today, Dr. Craig A. Evans, the John Bisagno Distinguished Professor of Christian Origins at Houston Baptist University. And I can say first person, along with my wife and my son, this man changed our life. He lifted us to an academic level of intellectual and serious study that will forever mark our ministry. And I know there are people listening right now that they have read your books. I mean, I had your commentaries long before I knew you. And but just before we close, I want you to just list off all the different universities that you've spoken in and lectured in around the world.
Well, I've had the opportunity to give lectures at the senior New Testament seminars at Oxford, at Cambridge, Durham, Yale, and a number of other lesser-known schools in the United States and in England, and in Germany. In fact, just last Thanksgiving, I did a series of lectures in Wuppertal, Germany. So Hebrew University too, by the way, in Jerusalem. I've lectured there, and
you've participated in digs.
I have. I've been able to act actively, even with a little bit of my back problems, with the Mount Zion dig, which is quite significant.
Yes.
Mount Zion dig is at the Mount Zion Gate, which is the old city, the south gate, south wall, and we are excavating under the direction of Shimon Gibson, a very respected, well-known archaeologist. We are excavating the home of a wealthy family, a home that was destroyed by the Romans when they captured the city of Jerusalem in the year 70. And it's possible that this is a high priestly home. Mm-hmm. So we don't know yet, it isn't confirmed, but if it is, then we are digging in a home of a family that would have been very opposed to Jesus and his movement.
Is this the family that I was in Jerusalem several weeks ago, and there's a underground actual replica of this large home that looks like, would that be the same family, or was somebody?
Well, and I know exactly what you're talking about. It's a museum that's under a building in the Jewish section of the old city. It's not a replica, it's the actual remains, the lower level of a home, a large compound home, probably not a nuclear family, but an extended family. It's suspected that it's probably the home of a high priestly, aristocratic, ruling priestly family. Now, where we're digging, it's a different location, but it's not very far from there.
Wow.
I don't think it would even be 100 meters away. And where we're digging, what we're uncovering looks very similar.
Mm-hmm.
So we're talking about, like, for example, a bathroom. This was one of the first things we found when the dig resumed in 2013. I was there, and It's plastered walls, tiled floor, plastered bathtub. You look at that and you think that's modern.
Right.
But you're looking at something that's 2,000 years old.
And the model has exactly that.
Yeah, so that's why I say we're in an area where the wealthy live, the kind of people that Jesus would have made very nervous, the kind of people that were on top of the social, economic, financial heap, and they didn't want anything to change it. And in comes Jesus from Galilee and his followers saying, you know what, you got to make some changes here. If you don't, it's all going to be destroyed. And so that's what is interesting. You're there in a home that very likely was peopled by powers that did not want to make a change. And the prophecy that Jesus uttered back in the 30s befell them a generation later. And we actually dug through the charcoal burn layer from the Roman destruction in the summer of 70 to get into the lower section of the home, which is well preserved. It kind of just makes, it gives you goosebumps when you realize, wow, I am touching history. I am going right back to the time that would have been contemporary to Jesus. There are people in this home that lived there that probably saw him teaching in the Temple Mount precincts. That is really something.
Amazing. How long will it be until you discover the difference at Houston Baptist University and set under scholars like Dr. Craig Evans? The School of Christian Thought at HBU literally has no peer. And we are grateful to God for the assembly of scholars, men and women that collectively are not only trained and sharp, but they are changing the world, impacting, as we've heard today, millions and millions of people. Visit hbu.edu/Christian Thought to learn more about the School of Christian Thought, or call HBU admissions at 281-649-3211. We have academic offerings online, residential, and the university. Let's get a plug in, and then we're going to meet again in just a few weeks on Think About It. And I'm going to give you as tough of questions as I can about the Gospels and about Jesus and about the gospel narrative. And I got a feeling you're not even slightly anxious about it. But just give a plug about the seminary and about the opportunity there.
What makes the seminary, I think, unique and very special is that the seminary has faculty who are serious academic guns. They're on the faculty of Houston Baptist University. But we're also tapping into a very powerful pastoral staff with academic credentials at Second Baptist Church.
One of the largest churches in the world.
Second Baptist Church has 7 campuses, 75,000 members. So it is the church in the Houston area, in fact, in the United States. It has, and that, when I say 75,000 members, that's just the people who are members. I'm not talking about the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, who listen in on their services, which are broadcast, which are made available. Senior Pastor Ed Young is on the radio morning and afternoon, 5 days a week. So this is a church that has huge reach. And so by partnering with them, students can learn practical theology and ministry from people who are involved in a huge, effective, successful church. And they can get their academic side of this from people who publish the books, who go places, who make the scholarly things happen. So how do you make it better? So that's what makes Houston Theological Seminary, I think, such a unique place and such a powerful seminary.
So check out Houston Theological Seminary of Houston Baptist University, held on the campus at Second Baptist Church, 6400 Woodway. And our long-term, highly respected friend, Dr. Ed Young Sr., and all of the 70 or 80 pastors that are on that staff. Dr. Evans, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to digging in deeper next time.
Good.